Hello everyone, welcome to session 3 of the Yellow Wallpaper course. We looked last week at, well, I say last, it was last week actually, but last session, depending on obviously when you listen to this, we looked at feminist literary theory, and I asked you to read the text and answer some of those questions just to sort of steer your understanding and ensure that you sort of know what's going on in the text. At the end of last session, I asked you to just think back over that story and try and apply some of those feminist literary theory questions to the Yellow Wallpaper. And we are going to discuss this in this session. I say discuss, it's quite difficult too, isn't it? I'm going to tell you what I think, and you can argue with me from your own homes, that's fine. So if we have just a little think then about the story, we know that CPG, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, is a crusading writer. She has a mission, and her mission is to sort of highlight the inequality in society, most particularly the inequality in marriage. So we could look at John, the husband and physician, as a symbol for the patriarchy. If you remember what that word means, for the sort of male control over society. And if we think about, you can apply that sort of just simply, superficially like that. But if we look at the character of John in particular, and we will go into to look at him, I think it's next session, he's quite controlling as well. So, it's not just, the man is a symbol of the patriarchy. It's his high level of control, and it's his dual role as husband and physician and doctor. That means that his control over the narrator is all the more powerful. And she sort of descends into madness. And so is CPG suggesting that if we sort of continue with a highly patriarchal society, that women are destined to be driven mad by it? Or perhaps I'm being a little bit too literal there when I'm considering her metaphor. Oh God, I've messed that up, haven't I? You know what I mean. So this notion as well that women need to rest, and we'll talk more about the rest cure, which was a 19th century phenomenon, and thinking will make them worse. And it's this idea, isn't it, that you don't educate the people you are trying to oppress. If you look back in history at oppressed peoples, their access to education and their access to knowledge is limited. If you look at, and lots of you will actually know more about this than me if you do history and look at slavery, but it's this idea that we will give the slaves language and Christianity, but we're not going to give them much more than that, because we don't want them to start thinking for themselves, because then they might realize that the position that they're in is wrong. And you'll see that if you become a student of history as you go on through your academic careers as well, you will see that oppressed peoples are not educated and are denied a proper education, because why would you want the people that you're oppressing to start thinking? You don't. You want them to be completely dependent on you and to not question their position. And you will see that actually in quite a lot of dystopian fiction as well. If you read widely any dystopian fiction, 1984, there's a Russian novel called We. I can't say the writer's name is Russian, I'm really sorry. We as in W-E. Again, their sort of education is limited. Yes, just have a little look. So it's that idea of sort of keeping the narrator at bay by not allowing her to think, and that's sort of was seen at the time in society as well. She doesn't have a voice. And again, this links to this idea of sort of not being allowed to think, because, my God, if you start thinking, you might realize that you're oppressed. And even worse, you can't have a voice. You might tell other people that you're oppressed and that they are too. So she doesn't have a voice, and she writes in secret. We know that. We discovered that last session. And it's this idea of her having to hide her thinking. And again, I know my year 10s will know that I was due to be in a play, actually, but it was we went into lockdown the day of the dress rehearsal, so we didn't actually do it in the end. And I was in a play called Blue Stockings. Now, the Blue Stocking Society was set up in the 1800s in Britain by a lady, I can't remember her name actually, but she wanted women to sort of get together almost in secret to discuss intellectual things. And it's that idea that you'd have to do it in secret. If you're interested in that notion, there's a book called Reading Lolita in Tehran. I can't remember who wrote it. It obviously is set in Iran, and it's this idea of a secret book club, because books like Lolita were banned. I mean, there's this idea of having to meet in secret. Or in this case, because the woman doesn't have anybody to meet, she writes in secret. And actually, who she meets with, metaphorically, is us, the reader, because she's speaking directly to us. When we think about the narrator as a mother, she calls it the baby, not my baby. And possibly they're rejecting that traditional role of the mother for women. If you remember back to our first session and Simone de Beauvoir and the second sex and her idea that women are seen as wives and mothers and nothing more, and is that very, very subtle omission of that possessive pronoun, my baby, to the baby, is that CPG sort of rejecting that role, traditional role of mother for women. If we think back to those key words as well, the idea of subversion, of sort of undermining a traditional idea. And at the end, what Charlotte Perkins Gilman does is makes John faint at the sight of his mad, in inverted commas, wife. And that sort of subverts the traditional. In Victorian literature, women fainted quite a lot, and over they went at anything. If you read any Victorian literature anymore, obviously, particularly those written by men, women faint quite a lot. The play, actually, I think the play is earlier. It definitely is earlier. It's 200 years earlier. Oh God, what's it called? I'm going to say The Rivals by Sheridan. I think it is. I studied it in uni. Anyway, there's a character in there called Lady Languish. Languish meaning, sort of to lie down, because she faints quite a lot. And there's this idea of sort of women being unable to cope with shock or excitement in any way. And actually what Charlotte Perkins Gilman does is subverts that role that and makes the husband, the patriarchy, faint at the end, which is bit of a dig, I think, there, isn't it? And also, if we think about the novel as a whole, is she suggesting that to restrict women's creativity can drive them mad? I think so. Women need intellectual stimulation. She sort of made a point of that, I think, throughout the story. And when we find out more about her life, which we will in subsequent sessions, there are 3 more after this, then you will have an idea more of that. So that's my thinking of how we can apply feminist literary theory to the Yellow Wallpaper. There are many, many other observations that I'm sure you can make if you think about it. There's a few to get you started. So today we're going to focus on symbolism. Symbolism is a writer's technique that is hugely important. And if you are going to read a text and respond to it creatively and perceptively, you really need to be looking for the writer's use of symbolism. that will score you marks in assessment objective 2, which is analysis. And by just using the term symbolism, you will sort of score some marks, if you like, in A01, assessment objective 1, which, along with other things, requires you to use literary terminology. So what I'm going to ask you to do is pause me shortly. You'll be pleased to know again. And I want you to look through the text, the descriptions of these 4 aspects of setting. We're going to look at setting as symbol, specifically the house, the bed, the garden, and the nursery. And I want you to think about what you consider Charlotte Perkins Gilman to be symbolising through her descriptions of these 4 aspects. You might want to think about these following questions. What do they suggest about the narrator's situation? What do they imply about her state of mind? What do they suggest about her position in society? And how do they link what we discussed about feminism in the text? So there's a few things to be thinking about. So what do you think they symbolise? And this is where, a bit like an extract question, but I'm asking you to look at just the sort of extracts that describe these 4 aspects of setting, and what do they symbolise? So pause me and we'll come back to discuss in a moment. Pause. Hello, everybody. I can't remember what comes next. Right, nothing, a moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put that to one side and get my copy of the Yellow Wallpaper up. And because what I've done is I've gone through and I've highlighted the bits I think are important. So we've got this first description here that describes the house in general and the garden. And we can see here it is quite alone. The house itself is isolated. And what can we take from that? We can link to the narrator. She is isolated. And this here, there are hedges and walls and gates that lock, and lots of little separate houses for the gardeners and the people. And this idea of everything being shut off from one another, and everybody being shut off from one another, and gates that lock. And it's this idea of literally she is isolated from everybody, much like the house is. But if we look at that from a figurative point of view, this notion of gates that lock, her potential is being locked up. Her creativity is being stifled. If we look at the garden here, a delicious garden. She likes it. I never saw it. Full of box bordered paths. And again, it's this idea then of being put into boxes, into categories. She is expected to be a wife and a mother and a woman in the 1800s, and therefore the notion of her being creative or writing or being free of mind, it can't be allowed to happen. So we need to think about that. And then the greenhouses too, but they are all broken now. And if we consider what a greenhouse is used for, they're used to grow things, but they are all broken now. So we can look at that as quite a stark symbol, I think, of her intellectual growth being hindered. If she were in a greenhouse that wasn't broken, she would be thriving as a plant. When I start doing stuff like this, and I've said this to my classes before, it always reminds me of that meme of like blue curtains, me, why are the curtains blue? Because they're blue. My English teacher, maybe the curtains are blue to suggest the melancholic state of mind, that. This is what we do in English, so forgive me for sounding like that meme English teacher, but that's me, and that's my job. So if we continue through, and we can look here at the description of the nursery, okay, on page 5. So it's of the house. Now, we could look at that as a symbol for the brain. Oh my God, I'm next level English teacher now, aren't I? Maybe I'm looking into it too much. I'm making myself giggle on this dreary Thursday morning. If the nursery is at the top of the house, and that is where she is locked eventually, then she is locked in her own brain, trapped. Her mind is trapped. You see where I'm going with this? It's been a while since I've done any real thinking like this, so forgive me if I sound rusty. Um, and we need to think about why the nursery and what the nursery would traditionally be used for. Why is that at the top of the house? I'll leave you think about that, and obviously pause me whenever you want to have a think. Um, then we can look here at this particular bit. I'm not going to go through every single thing. I'm just going to pick up bits and bobs. But the windows are barred for little children. Yes, they probably are, to stop little children falling out of the windows and climbing out. But then we know, because we've read the whole story, the whole text, that it also becomes a prison for her, a literal prison where she is trapped, and a metaphorical prison where she is unable to think, because she becomes unable to think because she can't stop thinking about the wallpaper, which I'll come on to later. Anyway, there's lots of people have discussed online. You might find things in study guides about this here. There are rings and things in the walls, and what are the rings for? Is it for shackling children to the walls and shackling the narrator? And apparently the sort of rings on the walls were quite common in Victorian or in 19th century nurseries. Quite what they were used for, I don't know. The paper has been stripped off in patches all around the head of the bed. And in a great place on the other side of the room, low down. And we know the paper comes to torment the narrator later on in the story. And what that description makes me think is, what has happened to the paper? Why has somebody already torn part of the paper off? What happened up there? And so it just creates this air of unease, I would say. There's lots of description of the paper. I will come to talk about it in the next slide briefly, and then you can go back through and look at the paper itself. I'm not going to take all the joy out of it by whittering on too much about the paper. Again, we've got this notion of the barred windows. Now she can see the garden out of the windows, and riotous old-fashioned flowers. My tummy's rumbling, I don't know if you can hear it. So this riotous is this idea that they are wild, these flowers, and she's looking out from her literal metaphorical prison at these flowers that are allowed to go wild. I mean, that must be so tormenting to her. And it makes me wonder that when she looks back at the wallpaper after having looked out at the garden like that, is that part of what causes her to start imagining seeing things grow and move in that wallpaper? And then we can look at gnarly trees. Gnarly, when I was younger in the 90s, was like, oh my God, that's gnarly, man. It was quite a sort of a slang for all, like, I was a skater girl. So, the actor is a real word. And it means that they have gnarls in them, little knots and little stumps and that sort of thing. And is that an idea of these trees having gnarls? Is that this notion of her sort of being stunted? I don't know. And what she can see, look here, is that she can see the bay and a little private wharf belonging to the estate. So a wharf being like a port, like, on water. And it's almost as if she can see her escape. But those bars are on that window, and she must be looking through the bars at freedom, and how that must drive her mad. And this idea of the lane that runs the house, and she sees the people outside, and it's this idea of that actually she doesn't do it necessarily to herself yet, but as a reader, we can sort of start comparing her situation with the situation of people outside, and seeing that it's really bad for her to be trapped. The furniture in the room, she says, it's no worse than inharmonious, so it just doesn't match. That's what she's saying here. I'm going to bring it all up. And it doesn't, that's fine. But it's this here. I never saw such ravages as the children have made here. So what on earth did those children do to that nursery, and why? The floor is scratched and gouged and splintered. The plaster itself is dug out here and there. There's a great heavy bed, which we found in the room. It looks as if it's been through the wars. So my question, and so should yours be, is what on earth happened in that room, in the attic? And if you read Jane Eyre, which is the year 12 text that you will study in September, with Mrs. Henry, the attic will become a major setting there as well. So it's this Victorian notion of things in the attic. Ooh. And that description there is really quite terrifying and quite sinister. And again, she can see that the outside. I'm not going to bore you. This idea I spoke, I think, before about the bed being immovable, it being nailed down, and that sort of makes me consider that this is where she sleeps every night. But it also makes me think of lunatic asylums as they would have been back in the 1800s, and of patients being strapped to their beds. And she could quite easily have been sent to a lunatic asylum, this woman, just for wanting to be creative, or just for having severe PMT. Those sort of things happen to women in the 1800s. So it sort of is that threat is in the background. I can't remember if there's any more. Let's just scroll through quickly. Oh, I think this is it. The bedstead is fairly gnawed. You can see this is right towards the end now, and the bed will not move. And this idea of the bedstead being gnawed, and she's talking about how the children did care about. And when we get to the end, it makes me think, did you do all of that actually? Were the gouges not there when you first arrived? And have you been biting at the bed? Yes, she has. So it's that symbolism there. I mean, I hope that helps. Looking at that symbolism that way, and you may well have some more ideas. I don't know if I've said this in any other one, or whether I go on to say it, but actually, I'll show you how to do it now. If I go back to this, if you press Control and F, you can search for anything. And what I did, and I don't know if I go on to talk about this later in any session, so if I do, forgive me, just ignore me later. But I looked at how many exclamation marks are in, and if you press next, look, it comes up with this counter. There are 89 exclamation marks in this 22, 23 page or 21 page text. That is an awful lot. And we can look at that as to what that suggests about her state of mind. And what you might want to look at is the frequency of the exclamation marks. Are they quite infrequent at the start? And do they become more and more frequent as she moves on, thus suggesting her sort of descent into madness? But that was just something I was thinking of then in my head. Terribly sorry. So hopefully that's got your sort of literary analysis brains working again. I know mine is a little bit rusty at the moment, as you may have heard. So feel free to pause me and go back through any descriptions and have a think about your own ideas and those questions on the left-hand side. I'm just going to talk you through, we're coming towards the end now of this session. I'm going to talk you through the wallpaper and the sun and moon. Okay, so there's a lovely illustration there that I found on the interwebs of a damask type wallpaper, which is what she sort of describes on the wall, and you can see a figure behind it there, which I think is great. Now this, I think, I made this a while ago now. I've just sort of taken some bullet points from an online study guide, so I'm not going to say that these are my ideas, but I just want you to begin thinking about your interpretation of the wallpaper and how it is used as a symbol by CPD. So we can say here that it's not a coincidence that the woman in the wallpaper is trapped behind a pattern. We can conceive of societal norms and mores as types of patterns that metaphorically restrict our movements. So that idea that society has its own patterns that we have to adhere to. The woman who the narrator imagines she sees behind a pattern is simply a more direct embodiment of that metaphorical restriction. So that one woman behind these patterns here is an embodiment of the metaphorical restriction put on women in society. And then this notion, which I think is really interesting, actually, when I studied this myself, because I did sort of study it myself as I was younger, as I think I mentioned before, I didn't ever think about this. And actually, when I read this, the internet didn't really exist as it does today, so I couldn't have sort of looked it up either. But scholars have made much of the fact the narrator starts referring to the wallpaper as the paper. Given that the narrator has a repressed literary bent, as in she wants to write, it is no great stretch of the imagination to suppose that the wallpaper becomes her text. Her intellect, restrained from reading and writing, the narrator's mind instead turns to her surroundings and settles upon the wallpaper as an intellectual challenge. And that's something I sort of said in the first slide, is that she is prohibited from writing. And so that, and I mentioned last time about that idea of a balloon, and it's sort of popping up from somewhere else, that her creativity has to come out somewhere. And if she's not allowed to write, the wallpaper becomes her paper on which she writes, she imagines. And it makes us consider that if Donna had just let her blooming write, then none of this would have happened. And then just to talk about sunlight and moonlight. So the moon has long been associated with female power, as with early fertility-centered societies and the Greek goddess Artemis, the huntress, whose natural realm was the light of the moon. So the moon is often a literary symbol for female either fertility or empowerment. You can look at Selene or Selena, the goddess of the moon, and Hecate also, who is seen as a witch. But actually, when you look at the history and the myths surrounding Hecate, she wasn't a witch at all. She was the goddess of the moon, and she went into the underworld with Hades to keep Persephone company. So you can look up all of that if you want to. But again, this idea with Hecate is that her legend, her story has been twisted to make her almost a villain. So her, as a woman, as a powerful woman, read into that what you will. So for the narrator of the Yellow Wallpaper, the contrast between daytime with its attendant limitations and nighttime with its attendant freedoms are symbolized by the alternating effect of sunlight and daylight on the wallpaper. Okay, so she becomes free at night. When the moon is up, she is her most powerful, if you like. So during the day, the narrator's freedom is checked by her physician or husband's rest treatment. Though she can see a bay in the distance and paths leading to it, she cannot move beyond the confines of the estate. Daytime is also associated with work, an activity overseen, if not performed, by men in Gilman's time. And as an upper middle class woman in the 19th century, the prevailing societal codes further restrict the narrator's daytime activities to housekeeping. So even if she were free and she sort of wasn't locked in an attic because she's going mad, as a woman in the daytime, she still would be housewife / mother, and her husband would be going out to work. So she would still have the restrictions of society. At night, however, while her husband is either asleep or away, the narrator's mind is free to roam the sub-pattern revealed by the moonlight upon the wallpaper. And you will notice that the moonlight brings out different patterns. Thus, the moonlight symbolically acts in consort, in partnership with the narrator's imagination to free it from the male-dominated confines of the daytime. And, like the woman in the sub-pattern, roam free of interference from those that would seek to hem it in. So that moon, when the moon comes out, makes the narrator more powerful, but it also manipulates the wallpaper to allow the figures behind it to roam more freely. And I mean, that's quite highfalutin, isn't it? And you may need to go back and read some bits, and you may want to go online and read more about the symbol of the moon in the Yellow Wallpaper, and indeed in literature in general, because that is a really excellent starting point when you come to start analysing a text is to start looking at light and dark imagery, the sun and moon. That will get you into a text. If in doubt, if you're ever, what's I going to say? Not focused. If you're ever presented, is the word I was looking for, with an unseen text, as you will be in A-level literature in year 13 with poetry, you will be pleased or horrified to learn that you will have to do some unseen poetry. That is a really good way of getting in, is to start looking at light and dark imagery in the sun and the moon. So maybe do some wider reading on that and how the moon is used in literature. And you may wish to obviously start looking into the moon as a symbol of female empowerment and fertility. Artemis, Hecate, Selena, or Selene, depending on what text you look at. They're really useful ones to look at. I forgot I put in this here. So there we go. There's a fascinating, as I've put it here, article on the symbolic meanings of the moon, and that might feed your what's the word, curiosity a bit more, and you can start looking. So hopefully that was useful to start sort of picking apart the text. That's the end of session 3. What we'll look at next session is John. Okay, so I'm going to pause this now, or stop this now. I am actually going to record the John one straight after, though, but I'm going to put it in separate sessions. So thank you, everybody. Hopefully that was useful. See you soon.